Nobody who was in the Meridian Aerospace lobby that Tuesday morning would forget what they saw. Not because of the noise. There wasn't noise. That was the part people kept returning to later, in the break room, in the parking garage, in the quiet of their own cars on the drive home. The quiet of it. The way a man could be told, in front of 37 people, that his access card no longer worked and his desk had already been cleared, and say nothing at all. Not one word. Just pick up the single cardboard box that security had left on the reception counter, tuck it under one arm, and walk out through the glass doors into the October morning, as though he had simply decided it was time to leave. My name is Paul Greer. I was the one who had set that box on the counter. I have thought about that for a long time. I had worked at Meridian Aerospace for 9 years, long enough to have seen 3 rounds of restructuring, 2 changes of ownership, and the kind of institutional forgetting that happens when a company grows faster than its memory of itself. I had watched colleagues come and go. I had signed the paperwork on 4 separate layoffs. I had learned to separate the work from the weight of it, the way you learn to not look too closely at certain things if you want to keep doing your job with any efficiency. But I watched Marcus Hale walk out of that lobby, and I looked very closely, and what I saw did not make sense to me for a long time. Let me tell you what I knew about Marcus Hale before that morning, and what I did not know, because the distance between those 2 things is the whole story. What I knew, Marcus had been with Meridian for 7 years. He worked in the fabrication support division, which meant he spent most of his time in the back half of the building where the floor smelled of machine oil, and the lighting was the fluorescent kind that makes everyone look a little unwell. He wore the same dark gray jacket most days, carried a battered metal thermos with a dent on the left side that he had never bothered to have replaced, and had a daughter named Clara who was 6 years old and who he mentioned, when he mentioned her at all, with a specificity that suggested he paid very close attention to who she was becoming. His wife had died 3 years before I met him. He had moved to Harwick, Pennsylvania from somewhere in Ohio and taken the fabrication support job because it was steady, and because Harwick had a school district with a reading program Clara had been accepted into, and because the house on Fenner Street had a backyard large enough for the things he intended to build there. I did not know what those things were at that time. What I also knew, Marcus was the kind of man who could walk into a failed system and find the thing that was wrong with it before anyone else had just explaining what the symptoms were. He did not make a performance of this. He did not write memos about it or copy the department head on his findings. He fixed the problem, logged the fix in the system, and went back to whatever he had been doing before. 3 times in the 2 years we had overlapped in the same department, I had watched him do this with production tolerances that should have grounded a delivery cycle. Twice with tooling calibration failures that the external contractor had already assessed as requiring full replacement. Once with a stress fracture analysis that the senior engineering team had run to 3 separate models on without arriving at a consistent answer. Marcus had looked at the raw data for 40 minutes and written 1 page of notes. The answer was correct. The senior team adopted it. No one cited him. What I did not know at the time, any of the reasons why. The woman who had cleared Marcus's desk was Renata Solano. She had been appointed executive director of operations 8 months earlier, brought in from a consulting firm in Philadelphia with a mandate to modernize Meridian's division structures and reduce what the board had identified as operational redundancy. She was precise, organized, and genuinely effective at the things she had been hired to do. She reorganized the procurement workflow in the first 60 days and cut the vendor approval cycle by 11 weeks. She restructured 3 reporting lines and eliminated a layer of middle management that had, by any honest accounting, been producing friction without output for several years. I had watched Renata work. I want to give her that. She came in early, and she stayed late, and she did not pretend to know things she did not know, which was, in my experience, rarer than it should have been at that level. She asked good questions of the people whose work she understood. The problem was the category of work she did not yet understand, which was the invisible kind. The work that does not appear in the logs the way work is supposed to appear because it lives in the gap between what a system says it is doing and what it is actually doing. That category of work is not captured by an efficiency review. It is not legible to a mandate that has been built around reducing redundancy. To a review of that kind, the man who keeps a system honest without leaving a paper trail looks, precisely and unfairly, like a man who is not doing very much. She was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. What happened was not the result of malice. It was the result of incomplete information, which is a different and in some ways more instructive kind of failure. What Renata did not know about Marcus Hale, that he had spent the 18 months before her arrival quietly rebuilding the calibration architecture for Meridian's entire CNC machining network from the inside, without authorization, without budget allocation, and without telling anyone he was doing it, because the original system had been built on a set of tolerance assumptions that were going to produce a catastrophic batch failure within 18 to 24 months. And he had calculated this himself, on his own time, and decided that waiting for the formal process to catch up with the problem was a choice he was not willing to make. The fix was invisible. That was the point. It did not announce itself. It simply worked quietly, the way the best structural repairs work, in the walls, in the foundation, in the parts of a system that people do not look at because nothing appears to be wrong. This was why Renata's efficiency review flagged Marcus Hale as a redundancy. His logged output for the previous 6 months showed fewer formal project completions than any other senior technician in the division. His file showed no advanced certification beyond his base credentials. His attendance record showed 3 early departures in a 4-week period, each one corresponding, I later learned, to parent-teacher conferences at Clara's school that he had not been able to reschedule. Renata reviewed the file on a Monday. On Tuesday morning, she called Marcus into the executive conference room at 8:47 a.m., informed him that his position was being eliminated as part of a divisional restructuring, thanked him for his service, and asked him to surrender his access card to the desk officer on his way out. Marcus said, according to the 2 people who had been in that room, "All right, nothing else." He did not explain. He did not ask for reconsideration. He did not name a single thing he had done that she did not know about. He stood up, shook her hand, and walked out. I was at the reception desk when he came through. I had been told to have the box ready. I had put his thermos in it, and the frame drawing from his desk. A child's drawing, a tall figure beside a row of machines, careful and precise in the way that children who are paying close attention draw things. I had put a small, flat stone in the box, too, one that had been sitting on the corner of his desk since before I had worked at Meridian. I did not know what it was. I included it because it seemed like it belonged to him. He picked up the box without looking at me. Then he stopped and looked at me. He said thank you for putting the stone in. He said it was from the driveway of the house in Harwick. Then he walked out. What followed in the 9 days after Marcus Hale left Meridian Aerospace was the kind of institutional unraveling that happens when a load-bearing wall is removed from a structure that did not know it had one. It began on Thursday, 2 days after his departure, with a batch rejection from the primary client on the Delta Force 7 contract. The client's quality assurance team had flagged a tolerance deviation in a set of machined housings that fell 11 microns outside specification. 11 microns. The kind of deviation that, in theory, should not have been possible given the calibration protocols that were on the books. The kind of deviation that the books had not actually been producing for 18 months, because Marcus had been quietly keeping the system within a tighter margin than the documented parameters required. Without him, the system had reverted. The quality team ran diagnostics on Friday. The diagnostics returned results that did not match the archived calibration logs, which meant either the equipment had drifted significantly in the past 48 hours, which was physically implausible, or the archived logs did not reflect what the equipment had actually been doing for some time prior. By Monday of the following week, the production floor supervisor, a man named Eddie Tran, who had worked at Meridian for 11 years, and who I had always found to be one of the clearer-headed people in the building, came to my office and said something I have not forgotten. He said, "Paul, whoever was keeping this system honest just left, and I don't think anyone knew he was doing it." The client escalation came on Wednesday. The Delta Force 7 contract was a 7-year supply agreement worth approximately $31 million annually to Meridian. The client's procurement director called Renata directly and informed her that pending resolution of the quality deviation and an independent audit of the calibration records, delivery acceptance would be suspended. For a company carrying the kind of debt structure that Meridian was carrying, that suspension was not theoretical damage. It was immediate. I learned the debt structure later, through channels that were not entirely my business. What I knew at the time was this. Renata came out of that phone call looking like a person who had been handed an accounting she had not expected and could not immediately calculate. She called the divisional engineering team into the conference room at 2 p.m. and asked them to explain the calibration discrepancy. The team was thorough and well-intentioned, and had very little idea what Marcus had done or how, because the nature of the work was that it did not appear in the logs the way work was supposed to appear. It lived in the tolerances, in the margins, in the gap between what the documentation said the machines were doing and what the machines were actually doing, day after day, without failure, until the person who had established that margin walked out through the glass doors with a cardboard box and a framed child's drawing. The team spent 4 hours in that conference room. They produced no resolution. On Thursday morning I drove to Harwick. I want to be clear that this was not authorized. Renata did not ask me to do it. I did it. I had put a ivory stone from Marcus Hale's house into a cardboard box, and because I had watched him walk out of a building he had been keeping from falling down, and because that seemed to me like something that deserved, at minimum, a conversation. The house on Fenner Street was a single story with a covered porch and a side yard that had been given over almost entirely to a workshop structure. Marcus had built himself, wood frame, with a corrugated metal roof and double doors facing the driveway. I could hear something running inside as I pulled up, a compressor or a lathe, I could not tell. A girl came around the side of the house as I was getting out of my car. She was small, with her father's way of looking at things before deciding what she thought about them. She asked if I was from Meridian. I said yes. She said her father was in the workshop. She said it without warmth or hostility, the way a person states a fact. I knocked on the workshop door. Marcus opened it. He was wearing a work apron over a flannel shirt and holding a pair of calipers. Behind him, the interior of the workshop was organized in the way the fabrication floor at Meridian was never organized, everything in its place, every surface clear except for the work currently in progress. Along the far wall, a row of components on a steel shelf, each one labeled in Marcus's hand. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Come in." I told him what had happened, the batch rejection, the calibration discrepancy, the client suspension. I told him the divisional team had spent 4 hours in the conference room and produced nothing actionable. I told him the contract value and the time frame of the suspension. He listened without interrupting. He asked one question when I finished. He asked whether the client had specified which component batch had deviated and what the documented tolerance range on that batch had been at the last signed-off calibration audit. I had brought the file. I handed it to him. He read it standing up, the way he read most things, still, without commentary. He set it on the workbench and picked up a notebook from the shelf to his left. He wrote 3 numbers in the notebook. He said the deviation was not equipment drift. He said the equipment was within its actual calibrated range. The problem was that the actual calibrated range was tighter than the documented range, and whoever ran the most recent audit had certified against the documented range without checking what the machines had been performing to. He said the gap between the two was his. He said he had been maintaining it informally because the formal process for updating the calibration baseline required a divisional engineering sign-off that he had requested 17 months earlier and never received. He said this without bitterness. He said it the way a person identifies as a structural fact that is simply true and requires no emotional annotation. I asked him what would fix it. He said, updating the baseline documentation to reflect actual performance, running a controlled recalibration with the updated parameters, and producing a corrected batch of the rejected housings within the new verified tolerance. He said it would take 9 days if the equipment cooperated, 11 if it did not. I asked if he would come back to do it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he would not come back to Meridian in the capacity he had left. He said he did not mean that in a punishing way. He simply said that a man who has been removed from a thing does not generally return to it as though the removal did not happen. I said I understood. I asked if there was another arrangement he would consider. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, an independent consulting engagement. Contract, not employment. A defined scope covering the calibration correction, the baseline documentation update, and a formal handoff report that any qualified technician could follow going forward. He said the rate would be his to name. He said he would need one condition beyond the rate. I asked what the condition was. He said the engineer who had submitted the formal request for the calibration baseline update 17 months earlier should receive written acknowledgement from division leadership that the request had been valid and had not been acted upon in a timely way. He said the engineer's name was Dominique Farrell and that she had submitted the request correctly and had been told informally that it was not a priority and that this was not her mistake and should not sit on her record as one. He did not say this with heat. He said it the way a person states a condition of a transaction that they consider non-negotiable. I told him I would convey it. I drove back to Meridian and sat in the parking garage for 7 minutes before going inside. I was thinking about thy workshop, Tanner Street, the components on the labeled the way Marcus had picked up that notebook from exactly the right place without looking for it. I was thinking about a man who had been told his position had been eliminated and had said, "All right," and meant it. Not because he was defeated. Because he had already known what he was and what he carried and understood that neither of those things had been in that conference room with Renata Solano. They had been in the workshop. They had been on the shelf. They had been in the machinery, holding a margin the documentation had never recorded. What I did not know, sitting in that parking garage, was the other part of the story. The part that would surface 5 weeks later and change the shape of everything. His name was Gregory Farr. He was Meridian's chief financial officer, and he had held that position for 6 years, and he had spent the last 3 of those years doing something that Renata Solano had not known about when she hired him, and that the board had not known about, and that had been visible, if you knew how to read the numbers, in the gap between Meridian's quarterly revenue statements and its actual cash reserve position. Farr had been structuring payments to a subsidiary procurement vendor that existed on paper and not in fact. The vendor, registered in Delaware under a name that bore no traceable connection to Farr, had received $4. $3 million over 31 months in payments coded as component sourcing costs. The components had never been sourced. The costs had been distributed across 8 budget lines in amounts small enough that no single line item triggered an automatic audit flag. Marcus had noticed this, not because he had been looking for it, because he had been trying to understand why the formal calibration baseline update request which he had submitted through Dominique Farrell with the correct budget justification had been denied at the divisional approval level. He had pulled the budget allocation records to understand where the funds that should have covered the update had been redirected. What he found was not a redirection. It was an absence. The funds were not in another budget line. They were not in the capital expenditure log. They were simply not in the financial system in the form the system said they should be. He had taken what he found to Dominique, and told her quietly that he thought there was something in the financials that was above both of their pay grades, and that the right move was to document it carefully and hold it, because a man who surfaces something like that without the right moment and the right standing can find himself holding something that burns him instead of what it should burn. He had held it for 11 months. When I came to the workshop on Fenner Street and told him about the client's suspension and the contract value, he had understood something I had not, that the calibration failure and the financial irregularity were connected at the structural level. Meridian was now in a documented quality crisis on its primary contract, which meant the financial statements were going to be audited as part of the client's due diligence process, which meant the hidden payments were going to surface, which meant Gregory Farr's position at Meridian was going to become, very quickly, untenable. Marcus had not designed this. He had not arranged the timing. But he had understood it, and he had decided that the right thing to do was to bring the calibration system back into honest documentation, because the 31 people who worked on that production floor had nothing to do with Gregory Farr's accounting decisions, and suspending a $31 million contract on their watch was a cost they should not have to pay for someone else's crime. This was the return condition, not his reputation, not his position, not satisfaction. 31 people with jobs that should not have been at risk. He came in on a Monday morning, 9 days after I had driven to Fenner Street. He came through the service entrance with his battered metal thermos and a canvas bag of documentation. Clara was at school. He had arranged it. He did not come through the lobby. He spent 9 days on the calibration system. He documented every parameter he had been maintaining informally, cross-referenced against the equipment logs, and produced a baseline report that was, according to the 2 outside engineers Renata brought in to review it, the clearest and most technically rigorous calibration documentation they had encountered in 11 years of reviewing aerospace manufacturing facilities. On the 5th day of his engagement, I found him in the calibration bay at 6:45 in the morning, before anyone else had come in. He was not running equipment. He was standing at the bench with a cup of coffee, looking at the machine in front of him the way I had once watched him look at the raw data, still without apparent urgency, as though the answer was already there, and he was simply allowing enough time to see it clearly. I asked him if he had been there long. He said since 5. I asked if he had slept. He said enough. I asked how he knew when enough was enough. He looked at me for a moment and said, "When Clara eats breakfast without rushing, the morning is going well." He said that was his measure for most things. He went back to looking at the machine. I went to my desk and thought about that for the better part of an hour. The corrected housing batch passed client quality assurance on the first inspection. The financial audit that the client's suspension had triggered found Gregory Farr's payment structure on the 4th day of review. Farr resigned on a Wednesday afternoon. His exit was quiet and clean, 1 announcement, 1 paragraph, no ceremony. The subsidiary vendor was dissolved. A legal process began that was not Meridian's to conduct. Renata called Marcus into the conference room on the Thursday after Farr's resignation. Not the executive conference room, the small one on the 2nd floor that looked out over the production floor. She asked him to sit down. She sat across from him. She said she wanted to understand something. She said she had read the calibration report twice, and the budget documentation he had submitted 17 months earlier, and Dominique Farrell's formal request, and the denial memo. She said she had read them in the order they had happened, and she wanted to understand why he had not told her, when she came in, when she was reviewing the division, what he had been doing. Marcus looked at her steadily. He said that it was not his place to make a case for himself to someone he had just met. He said he had assumed the work would speak for itself over time, and that if it did not, he would find another place to work. He said he did not consider either of those outcomes a failure. She said that was, in her experience, an unusual way for a person to think about their own career. He said he supposed it depended on whether you thought a career was the point. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked what the point was. He said, doing the work correctly, making sure the machines ran honest, making sure Dominique's name was clear, making sure the 31 people on the floor had a contract to work against. He said he would like to know whether Dominique had received the written acknowledgement he had named as a condition of the engagement. Renata said she had written it herself, that it had gone into Dominique's file, and that she had spoken with Dominique directly about the timeline of events. Marcus nodded. She offered him his position back. She said she understood if he declined it. She said she was making the offer because not making it would be a different kind of institutional forgetting than the kind that had removed him in the first place. He looked out the window at the production floor for a moment. He said he would think about it. He said he had something he needed to finish in the workshop first. The something he needed to was a workbench he had been building for Clara. She had told him 3 weeks earlier that she wanted to learn how things worked from the inside, and he had told her he would build her a place to learn in. He had been cutting the lumber in the evenings, fitting the joints on weekends. He finished it the Saturday after his meeting with Renata. Clara ran her hand along the surface the way her father ran his hand along a machine before starting it, flat, still, like a greeting. She asked if it was hers. He said it was. She asked if she could put her name on it. He said that was a reasonable thing to do. He handed her a wood-burning pen and showed her where to hold it. She wrote her name along the front edge, in letters that were careful and large and not quite even. Then she looked at what she had written and looked at him. She said she wanted it to last a long time. He said he had built it to last a long time. She went back to the house to wash the soot off her fingers, and Marcus stood in the workshop for a few minutes, with the light coming in through the high window and the bench sitting in the middle of the floor. He put his hand on the surface again. He was thinking, I later learned, when he told me this himself over coffee the following Tuesday, about a word his wife had used once, years before Clara, years before the house on Fenner Street, when they had been living in Ohio and he had fixed a lathe at the community workshop that no one else had been able to figure out. She had watched him work on it and then watched him step back when it ran clean, and she had said, "That's what you are, isn't it? Not a fixer, a keeper. Someone who keeps things running for longer than they should have run." He had not known then how accurate that was. He thought he knew now. He called Renata on the following Monday and told her he would accept a modified arrangement, not his former position. A new one, staff calibration architect, a role that had not existed before but that both of them understood Meridian needed and had needed for some time. The role would involve formal authority to update calibration baselines without divisional sign-off delays, and a reporting line that bypassed the budget layer that had allowed FAR's structure to obscure the original request. Renata said she could do that. She said she would have the offer in writing by Wednesday. He said he had one condition. She said she assumed he would. He said, Dominique Farrell should be given the opportunity to lead the documentation team for the new capitalization framework. He said she had written original baseline update proposal correctly, and that the proposal was the foundation of everything that had been fixed. She should be the one who formalized it. Renata said she would make that happen. Marcus came back to Meridian on a Thursday morning. He came through the main entrance. He did not make an announcement. He walked through the lobby, nodded to the desk officer, and went downstairs to the production floor. Eddie Tran was the first person to see him. Eddie stopped what he was doing, looked at Marcus for a moment, and then went back to what he was doing. He did not say anything. But later that afternoon, he stopped by the calibration station where Marcus was working and set down a cup of coffee without being asked. The stone from the Fenner Street driveway was back on the corner of the desk. I had driven it out to him the previous Friday. I had not been asked to. It seemed like the right thing. I have thought in the time since all of this happened about what I witnessed in that lobby on a Tuesday morning in October. A man told that what he had built was not worth keeping, walking out with a cardboard box and a child's drawing and a stone from his own driveway, saying nothing, not because he had nothing to say, Because he had already understood something that the room had not. He had understood that the work he had done did not disappear when he left the building. It was in the machines. It was in the tolerances. It was in the margin between what the documentation said and what the equipment was actually doing, day after day, without failure, because he had kept it honest. That kind of work does not need to announce itself. It simply holds. Until it does not hold anymore, and then the silence of it becomes suddenly very loud, and the people who filled that silence with their own noise have to go looking for the man they let walk out through the glass doors on a Tuesday morning. He had known they would. He had not done it for that reason. He had done it because the machines needed to run honest, and because 31 people deserved a contract to work against, and because his daughter had asked him once, walking to the car in the morning, why people always looked at them the way they did, the sideways glances, the long pauses, the polite assessments that missed the point entirely. He had told her it was because they did not know who he was yet. Sitting in the workshop on Fenner Street the Saturday after the bench was finished, with Clara's name burned in the edge and the light coming down through the high window, Marcus thought he had not been entirely honest with her about that. The truth, he thought, was simpler. Most people look at a thing and see only the surface. What it appears to be from the outside, the dent in the thermos, the wear on the jacket, the quiet at the reception desk. They move on quickly because the surface gives them enough to file it under ordinary, and they never find out what they missed. Not because the truth was hidden from them, because they did not look long enough. Clara would look long enough. He was already certain of that. She looked at everything the way he had taught her to look at a machine before starting it, flat, still, like a greeting, as though whatever was inside it deserved to be treated as worth understanding before you decided what to think. That was the only inheritance he had been certain of from the beginning. The workbench, the workshop, the house on Fenner Street. Those were the rest of it. He turned off the work light, closed the double doors, and went inside to make dinner. This is a work of fiction. All names, characters, companies, institutions, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional and are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events or organizations is purely coincidental. This story was created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been underestimated. Every week, we tell the stories of the people the world walked past too quickly. They were worth stopping for.